Russia is facing its worst week since the Ukraine conflict began, with simultaneous crises unfolding across military, economic, and political fronts. The Russian ruble has plunged to record lows, while military casualties have reached unprecedented levels, raising the question, could this be the turning point in the prolonged war? Could this string of devastating setbacks signal the collapse of Moscow's strategy, or will Russia find a way to turn the tide? Recent developments from severe ammunition shortages and a failed winter offensive to growing international isolation fuel heated debates. Can Russia withstand these blows, or is it heading toward an inevitable downfall? If you think Russia will lose this war, please comment 1. Now let's delve into the factors shaping this critical moment and what it could mean for the future of the conflict. The Russian economy faces unprecedented turbulence as multiple indicators signal severe distress in the latest Russia-Ukraine war update today. The ruble has experienced its most dramatic decline since the 1998 financial crisis, marking a defining moment in Moscow's economic stability. The Russian currency has plummeted by approximately 20% against the dollar since early February 2022, with recent trading showing the ruble exceeding 105 per dollar. This sharp depreciation has triggered a chain reaction across the economy, pushing annual inflation to 7.5% by the end of November. The central bank's aggressive response, raising the key interest rate to 21%, highlights the severity of the currency crisis. Moscow's military spending has soared to unprecedented heights, marking a threefold increase compared to its pre-war levels. The government has committed a staggering $160 billion to military operations, now constituting 40% of the country's total budget. This extraordinary surge in defense expenditure has placed immense pressure on Russia's fiscal framework, reshaping the nation's economic priorities. A substantial 37.3% of all budget expenditures are now directed toward defense, highlighting the centrality of military efforts in state planning. Even more strikingly, military expenses have exceeded 10% of Russia's GDP, a figure that underscores the scale of resources being funneled into sustaining the war effort. Beyond government allocations, combined regional and private expenditures tied to war-related activities have also surpassed initial estimates, further straining economic stability. This level of spending has sparked significant concerns about the long-term sustainability of Russia's financial strategy, especially as the country faces increasing domestic and international economic challenges. Western sanctions have finally begun showing tangible effects on Russia's economic foundation. Energy revenues have declined sharply by almost 40% from January through October 2023 compared to 2022. The impact has been particularly severe in several key areas. The sanctions regime has immobilized approximately $280 billion in Russian reserves, severely limiting Moscow's financial flexibility. Trade restrictions have forced Russia to retreat from global markets, making it increasingly dependent on a smaller group of partners. This isolation has restricted Russia's access to new technologies and innovations, pushing the economy toward a weaker, less productive trajectory. The economic pressure has intensified as Russia struggles with depleting financial reserves. The National Wealth Fund currently holds about $146 billion, with nearly half in gold and liquid yuan assets, reflecting Moscow's diminishing options for managing its economic challenges in this latest phase of the Russia-Ukraine war update today. The latest Ukraine news reveals unprecedented military setbacks for Russian forces, with casualty figures reaching historic highs. Recent reports indicate Russian forces suffered their highest ever daily losses, with approximately 2,200 casualties in a single day, marking a devastating milestone in the conflict. The scale of Russian losses has reached staggering proportions, with total casualties surpassing 770,000 since the invasion began. In November alone, Russian forces endured an average of 1,523 casualties per day, representing the highest monthly average since the war's start. These losses are particularly significant as they occurred during intensified offensive operations, with Russia sacrificing substantial manpower for minimal territorial gains. Russian military hardware losses have escalated to critical levels, reaching their highest point in 2 years. October witnessed devastating equipment casualties, including 253 infantry fighting vehicles destroyed, 103 tanks lost, 41 armored personnel carriers were disabled, 4 aircraft and 1 helicopter downed. The material losses have forced Russia to deploy increasingly obsolete equipment, including World War II-era tanks and outdated weapon systems. Russian forces have lost approximately 9,600 main battle tanks and 19,900 armored personnel carriers since the invasion began. The Russia-Ukraine war update today highlights severe morale issues plaguing Russian forces. A recent internal report revealed hundreds of conscripts surrendering without fighting, particularly in the Kursk region. The situation has become so dire that over 5,000 court cases related to desertion have been processed since mobilization began. The psychological toll on Russian troops has reached critical levels, with numerous reports of suicides and psychological breakdowns. Supply shortages, inadequate training, and poor equipment maintenance continue to erode combat effectiveness. The average lifespan of a Russian conscript after signing their contract has dropped to approximately 1 month, contributing to widespread demoralization among troops. These military setbacks represent more than just numerical losses, they signal a fundamental weakening of Russia's combat capabilities. The combination of record casualties, equipment destruction, and collapsing morale presents an unprecedented crisis for Russian military leadership, compounding the economic challenges already straining Moscow's war effort. Strategic setbacks have emerged as a defining feature of Russia's military campaign, with the latest Ukraine news highlighting systematic failures in planning and execution. Recent assessments reveal fundamental flaws in Russian military strategy that extend far beyond individual battles. Russia's winter offensive has fallen dramatically short of its objectives, failing to secure the Donetsk and Luhansk region administrative borders by its March 31st deadline. The campaign resulted in devastating losses, with Russian forces losing over 400 armored vehicles, while failing to achieve any significant territorial gains. The offensive's collapse was so complete that even Russia's National Guard acknowledged its negative impact on troop morale. The deterioration of Russian military effectiveness stems from deep-rooted command and control issues. Their decision-making process, known as the Observe, Orient, Decide, Act loop, has proven exceptionally slow due to over-centralized authority. The rigidity of this command hierarchy has significantly impaired Russia's ability to adapt and respond effectively in a rapidly evolving battlefield environment. One of the most glaring consequences has been a consistent failure to adapt to dynamic battlefield conditions, leaving Russian forces unable to counter the agility and strategic ingenuity of their Ukrainian adversaries. This inflexibility has also led to a poor response to Ukrainian counteroffensives, often allowing Kiev's forces to capitalize on Russian vulnerabilities. Furthermore, the delay in tactical responses to emerging threats has repeatedly compromised Russia's ability to regain control or defend key positions. Compounding these issues is a frequent breakdown in operational security, as the slow and cumbersome decision-making process has exposed Russian forces to exploitation by more adaptable and better coordinated Ukrainian troops. These systemic flaws underscore the challenges facing Moscow's military efforts and raise serious questions about its capacity to sustain its current strategy in the ongoing conflict. The Russia-Ukraine war update today reveals a series of critical tactical errors that have undermined Russian military effectiveness. Russian forces have consistently mishandled their equipment, with tanks being deployed without proper infantry support or air coverage. The military's performance has been further compromised by poor logistics planning has led to supply shortages, with troops competing for basic resources. Intelligence failures have resulted in missiles being launched based on outdated maps and incorrect intelligence. Perhaps most telling, Russian soldiers' use of personal cell phones has allowed Ukrainian forces to track their locations and target them effectively. The scope of these failures is reflected in territorial losses, with Russian forces capturing merely 70 square kilometers across Ukraine in March. Military analysts attribute these shortcomings to Russia's inability to conduct effective combined arms operations beyond the company level. The situation has been exacerbated by corruption within the military ranks, which has severely impacted personnel readiness and supply chain efficiency. These strategic failures have been compounded by Russia's inability to achieve air superiority, a critical factor that has allowed Ukrainian forces to maintain effective resistance. The Russian military's approach to warfare remains rooted in outdated doctrine, characterized by frontal attacks and attrition warfare, which has proven effective against modern defensive capabilities. The latest intelligence reports reveal a severe breakdown in Russia's military supply chain, marking a critical vulnerability in their war effort. Recent assessments show Russian forces struggling with unprecedented logistical challenges that threaten their operational capabilities. Russia's domestic ammunition production has fallen significantly short of wartime demands. Current production capacity stands at approximately 1.3 million 152mm shells and 800,000 122mm shells annually, while daily consumption rates have fluctuated between 5,000 to 50,000 rounds. This shortfall has forced Russian forces to rely on old reserves, with troubling consequences for both quality and supply stability. Much of the ammunition drawn from these reserves shows visible signs of deterioration, including rust and structural damage, raising serious concerns about its reliability in combat. Additionally, up to 50% of these shells have been deemed unsatisfactory due to decades of improper storage, further undermining their effectiveness. Analysts predict that these stockpiles will be critically depleted by mid-2025 if current trends persist, posing a major threat to Russia's ability to sustain its war effort over the long term. Alongside ammunition shortages, equipment maintenance has emerged as another critical issue plaguing Russian forces. Military operations have exposed widespread maintenance failures, resulting in unprecedented rates of vehicle breakdowns. Many combat vehicles have suffered from basic mechanical issues, such as loose screws or fallen pins, that could have been avoided with proper pre-deployment checks. However, rushed deployment schedules have left little time for adequate maintenance. Compounding this problem is the lack of recovery infrastructure, with some formations having only 2 recovery vehicles available to tow damaged equipment. These deficiencies have not only hampered battlefield effectiveness but also strained logistical resources, creating a cascading effect that further weakens operational capabilities. The combination of ammunition production shortfalls and equipment maintenance crises paints a grim picture of Russia's military logistics, raising serious doubts about the sustainability of its current strategy and its capacity to endure a protracted conflict. The Russian military's logistics system has demonstrated significant vulnerabilities, particularly in its heavy reliance on railways. Analysis shows that Russian forces cannot effectively sustain operations beyond 90 miles from their supply dumps. The situation has deteriorated due to several factors. The introduction of HIMARS has forced significant adjustments to the Russian logistics network. Supply depots have been moved farther from the front lines, severely impacting the efficiency of resupply operations. Despite attempts to adapt, Russian forces continue to face severe challenges in maintaining adequate supply lines, with particular difficulties in delivering essentials including food and fuel, maintaining ammunition supply chains, and supporting equipment maintenance operations. The logistics crisis has been compounded by Western sanctions, which have severely impacted Russia's ability to produce new systems and repair existing ones. This has forced Moscow to requisition military equipment originally intended for foreign allies, further straining international relationships and military readiness. Recent adaptations have included streamlining supply chains and relocating depots, but these measures have resulted in reduced firepower capabilities. The Russian military's attempt to overcome these challenges through mobilization has added further strain, with the system struggling to absorb and equip nearly 300,000 new troops. Moscow's diplomatic position has deteriorated to its lowest point since the Soviet collapse, as the latest Ukraine news highlights unprecedented international rejection of Russian actions. The UN General Assembly's overwhelming vote against Russia's invasion, with 141 countries condemning Moscow's actions and only 5 nations supporting Russia, marks a historic diplomatic isolation. Russia's diplomatic influence on the global stage has eroded dramatically, underscoring the country's increasing isolation amid its ongoing conflict in Ukraine. This decline is marked by a series of setbacks that highlight the diminishing support for Moscow's geopolitical agenda. Notably, 143 nations have unequivocally condemned Russia's territorial annexations in Ukraine, reflecting a broad international consensus against its actions. Among the few countries that have consistently stood by Russia are Belarus, North Korea, Eritrea, and Syria, states with limited global sway, underscoring the narrowness of Moscow's remaining support base. Adding to its challenges, Russia faced a significant blow when it was suspended from the United Nations Human Rights Council, signaling a severe reputational loss on the international stage. Efforts to counteract its declining influence, such as attempting to block Swiss-led peace initiatives, have largely failed, further emphasizing the erosion of Moscow's diplomatic leverage. Compounding these global setbacks is the collapse of Russia's traditional alliances, particularly among former Soviet states, which have increasingly distanced themselves from Moscow's orbit. Kazakhstan, a historically close partner, has taken a firm stance by refusing to recognize the Russian-backed Donbass republics, signaling a clear departure from alignment with Kremlin policies. Armenia has gone even further by canceling planned military exercises under the Collective Security Treaty Organization framework and openly seeking United Nations peacekeepers to address its security concerns, moves that underscore its waning confidence in Moscow's ability to serve as a reliable partner. Kyrgyzstan has followed suit, canceling scheduled military cooperation with Russia and signaling a pivot toward greater independence in its defense strategy. Meanwhile, Central Asian nations as a whole are broadening their military relationships with Turkey, actively diversifying their security partnerships, and reducing their reliance on Russian support. Even China, once considered Moscow's strongest partner, has shown increasing reluctance to support Russian initiatives. Major Chinese banks have stopped accepting payments from sanctioned Russian financial institutions, while India has halted premium crude oil purchases. The Russia-Ukraine war update today reveals deepening international isolation as global financial institutions implement stricter compliance with Western sanctions. Banks in the UAE have suspended accounts linked to Russian trade, while Turkish financial institutions face mounting pressure over Russian transactions. The diplomatic fallout extends beyond traditional spheres of influence. Russia's military presence in Syria, once a cornerstone of its Middle Eastern strategy, has weakened significantly. Moscow's ability to project power globally has diminished, with former partners increasingly viewing alignment with Russia as a liability rather than an asset. The isolation has reached such levels that even countries traditionally neutral toward Moscow have begun distancing themselves. Vietnam has maintained careful neutrality, while other nations in the global south increasingly view Russia's actions as destabilizing to international order. This shift represents a significant departure from historical patterns of support, leaving Russia increasingly dependent on a small circle of politically isolated states. The cumulative effect of these diplomatic setbacks has fundamentally altered Russia's global standing. With 350 foreign companies having ceased or curtailed operations in Russia, and international academic institutions severing ties with Russian universities, Moscow faces unprecedented challenges in maintaining its remaining international relationships. Nuclear deterrence, long considered Russia's ultimate strategic asset, has experienced an unprecedented erosion of effectiveness in the latest phase of the conflict. Recent analysis reveals how Moscow's nuclear strategy has fundamentally failed to achieve its intended objectives. Putin's nuclear coercion strategy has proven remarkably ineffective, with over 50 instances of senior Russians making direct or indirect nuclear threats since February 2022. The repeated threats have backfired spectacularly, as Ukraine has consistently called Putin's bluff by crossing supposed red lines without facing nuclear consequences. Notable examples include Ukraine's successful liberation of Kherson, strikes against the Black Sea Fleet, counter-offensives in Russian-occupied territories, and long-range attacks on critical Russian military assets have starkly exposed the hollowness of Russia's nuclear threats. The failure of this strategy reveals deep flaws in Russia's strategic planning. Moscow's reliance on nuclear rhetoric stems from fundamental miscalculations. It overestimated the utility of nuclear weapons in the context of the Ukrainian conflict, where conventional strategies play a far more decisive role. Additionally, the Kremlin misjudged the resolve of Western nations, assuming that nuclear threats would deter them from supporting Ukraine militarily. Perhaps most significantly, it underestimated the reaction of the global South, where the repeated invocation of nuclear threats has eroded Russia's standing and invited widespread condemnation. The war has exposed Russia's lack of sufficient conventional weapons to address many threats, forcing an over-reliance on nuclear posturing. This strategic weakness became evident when Putin's nuclear threats failed to prevent the West from steadily increasing military support to Ukraine. The international response to Russia's nuclear threats has been devastating to Moscow's credibility. Even traditionally neutral or supportive nations have distanced themselves from Russia's nuclear rhetoric. China's leadership explicitly denounced the use of, or threats to use, nuclear weapons, while India canceled its annual summit with Russian leaders. Russia's nuclear deterrence strategy has failed primarily because it attempted to use nuclear threats as a coercive tool in a war of conquest, rather than for legitimate defensive purposes. Within the West, officials have systematically dismantled the credibility of Russia's nuclear threats. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin confirmed there was no indication of imminent nuclear weapons use. The British Prime Minister resolutely stated that such rhetoric would not deter support for Ukraine, and the EU's foreign policy chief called these threats completely irresponsible. The collapse of Russia's nuclear deterrence effectiveness represents a strategic failure of the highest order. Moscow's attempts at nuclear coercion have not only failed to achieve their objectives but have also resulted in increased Western military support for Ukraine. The repeated empty threats have transformed what was once considered Russia's greatest strategic asset into a source of diplomatic isolation and strategic weakness. Internal tensions in Russia have reached a critical point as the combined effects of military setbacks and economic pressure spark unprecedented domestic instability. Recent polls from the Levadata Center show approximately 15% of the Russian population now openly disapproves of Putin's leadership, marking a significant shift in public sentiment. Public opposition has intensified despite severe repression, with authorities recording over 14,900 detentions in anti-war protests during the first weeks of the invasion. This resistance is not limited to street protests but has permeated professional communities, showcasing widespread dissent across various sectors. In the technology industry, over 30,000 workers have signed open letters condemning the war. Similarly, more than 6,000 medical professionals, 4,300 teachers, and approximately 17,000 artists have formally expressed their opposition. This level of coordinated objection underscores the depth of dissatisfaction, even in the face of severe repression and significant personal risk. A deepening generational divide has emerged within Russia's power structure, creating unprecedented tensions among ruling elites. The conflict is most evident among three distinct groups: Putin's older inner circle, who continue to dominate key resources, mid-level bureaucrats frustrated by career stagnation, and a younger generation of administrators seeking opportunities for advancement. This power struggle has intensified as Putin's ultra-conservative personnel policies have created a lost generation of ambitious officials with diminishing prospects. The situation is particularly acute among regional governors, who are increasingly settling into long-term positions and developing independent power bases. The North Caucasus has emerged as a focal point of separatist sentiment, with multiple independence movements gaining momentum. The formation of volunteer battalions opposing Moscow's authority signals growing regional resistance. These developments include the emergence of the Dagestan National Center advocating for independence and the formation of the English Liberation Army represent significant challenges to central authority. The situation is exacerbated by Moscow's shifting economic priorities, as resources are increasingly diverted toward the Russian Far East. Regional governors, once dependent on Kremlin protection, have developed their power bases within local elite structures. This transformation has created a network of feudal lords in Russian regions, whose influence could become particularly significant during periods of political instability. The regime's response has been to intensify repression, with authorities encouraging citizens to report anti-war sentiments among friends and family. The State Duma speaker recently suggested sending war critics to work in Magad's mines, echoing Soviet-era practices. Military mobilization has particularly strained center-regional relations, with approximately 5,000 court cases related to desertion being processed. The emergence of regional paramilitary enterprises has added another layer of complexity to Russia's internal security challenges. These internal pressures have created what experts describe as a perfect storm of challenges for the regime, with depleting Kremlin reserves making it increasingly difficult to maintain basic living standards, and regional budget deficits mounting. The potential for further instability continues to grow in this latest phase of the Russia-Ukraine war update today. The latest assessments reveal profound long-term implications for Russia's future, as the combined impact of military setbacks, economic sanctions, and diplomatic isolation threatens to reshape the nation's trajectory. Analysts project these challenges will persist well beyond the current conflict, fundamentally altering Russia's position in the global order. The Putin regime faces mounting pressure as multiple destabilizing factors converge. The government's fiscal position has become increasingly precarious, with military spending reaching an unprecedented 37.3% of all budget expenditures. This massive allocation to defense has created severe strains across other sectors, forcing difficult choices between military needs and social programs. Key indicators of Russia's stability point to significant challenges ahead. Public debt is rising sharply, regional budget deficits are mounting, and social spending cuts appear unavoidable by 2025. These fiscal pressures are compounded by growing fragmentation within the Russian elite, as power centers vie for influence amid dwindling resources. The regime's ability to maintain social stability is further challenged by demographic pressures and the exodus of skilled workers, with approximately 500,000 people having left Russia since the war began. This brain drain particularly affects the technology sector, where Russia faces a shortage of nearly 1 million IT specialists. The task of reconstituting Russia's military capabilities presents unprecedented challenges. The scale of losses has been staggering, with over 15,000 pieces of equipment destroyed and more than 350,000 casualties since February 2022. Military analysts highlight two primary obstacles: personnel shortages and equipment restoration. On the personnel front, demographic constraints severely limit recruitment, while the loss of experienced officers and specialists has undermined operational effectiveness. Volunteer recruitment rates continue to decline, further exacerbating the issue. In terms of equipment, only 20% of new armored vehicles are being built from scratch, with the remainder relying heavily on refurbishing older models. Russia's defense industry faces a critical dependence on foreign components and suffers from limited production capacity. The military's reconstitution efforts are further complicated by Western sanctions limiting access to advanced technology. Russia's defense industry faces significant challenges in producing modern equipment, forcing reliance on simplified versions of existing systems. Economic projections paint a sobering picture of Russia's recovery prospects. The World Bank estimates that Russia's GDP will drop by 2.1% in 22, with a further decline expected. The economic outlook is characterized by several structural challenges. The ruble's weakness has become a persistent problem, falling past the psychological barrier of 100 rubles per dollar. This currency depreciation has triggered inflation concerns, forcing the central bank to raise interest rates to 21%. Long-term recovery faces significant obstacles due to several critical factors. Western sanctions continue to block access to advanced technology, while reduced energy export revenues, down 40% year-over-year, have undermined a key pillar of the Russian economy. Meanwhile, growing economic dependence on China, which now accounts for 38% of Russian imports, has further limited Moscow's options. With restricted access to global financial markets and an increasingly isolated position on the world stage, Russia faces a prolonged period of economic stagnation. The economic transformation has led to what experts describe as a stagnation trap, characterized by low growth potential and chronic internal imbalances. The situation is particularly concerning given Russia's increasing reliance on military production, with defense spending projected to reach 6% of GDP in 2024. International financial experts project that Russia's long-term economic growth will likely remain below 1% annually, marking a significant departure from pre-war growth trajectories. This economic stagnation threatens to undermine Russia's ability to maintain its military capabilities and social stability, potentially creating a cycle of declining influence and increasing domestic challenges. The military-industrial complex faces particular strain, with production facilities struggling to maintain output levels. Despite operating around the clock, key plants like Uralvagonzavod and Kurgamashzavod cannot keep pace with battlefield losses. This production shortfall is exacerbated by Western export controls targeting critical components and technologies. Russia's disastrous week could mark a pivotal moment in the Ukraine conflict, as crises on military, economic, and diplomatic fronts converge to threaten Moscow's ability to sustain its war effort. These setbacks highlight not just short-term challenges but deep structural weaknesses in Russia's military, economic, and political foundations. How do you think these developments will shape the future of the conflict and Russia's global standing? Share your thoughts in the comments and click like if you find this video useful information for you. Thank you for taking the time to watch the video. See you in the next videos.